Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that a nuclear war could begin at any moment. In 1962, this terrifying possibility was becoming a reality. The world was divided between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, and both possessed weapons powerful enough to destroy entire cities within minutes. Their rivalry was known as the Cold War, and although the two nations had not officially declared war on each other, they were constantly competing for power, influence, and military advantage. Then, in 1959, a revolution led by Fidel Castro transformed Cuba and brought a new government to power just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. Relations between Cuba and the United States quickly collapsed, and in 1961, the United States supported an invasion by Cuban exiles known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. But the invasion failed, and Castro became even more determined to protect his country from another American attack. At the same time, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev saw an opportunity that could completely change the balance of power. American nuclear missiles were already positioned close to the Soviet Union, so Khrushchev decided to place Soviet nuclear-capable missiles in Cuba, right next to the United States. It was a secret operation, carried out under enormous pressure and with one dangerous goal: to protect Cuba, strengthen the Soviet position, and send a powerful warning to America. But there was one problem. The United States had no idea what was being built on the island. And as Soviet missiles quietly moved closer to becoming operational, the world was unknowingly moving toward a confrontation that could bring humanity closer to nuclear war than ever before. It was October 1962, and while ordinary people in America and around the world continued with their daily lives, something extremely dangerous was taking place in Cuba. American intelligence had noticed unusual Soviet military activity on the island, but no one yet knew the full truth. Then, on October 14th, an American U-2 spy plane flew high above Cuba on a secret reconnaissance mission and captured photographs that would change everything. When intelligence analysts examined the images, they discovered Soviet missile sites under construction, missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads, positioned just 90 miles from the American coast. On October 16th, President John F. Kennedy was shown the photographs. The moment he understood what he was looking at, the situation became terrifyingly clear. The Soviet Union was secretly placing nuclear weapons in America's backyard. Kennedy immediately gathered his closest military and political advisors in a series of secret meetings, because every possible response carried enormous risks. Some advisors demanded immediate airstrikes to destroy the missile sites before they became operational. Others argued that the United States should invade Cuba and remove the threat completely. But Kennedy knew that attacking Cuba could trigger a Soviet response, and that response could lead to something far worse: a direct confrontation between two nuclear superpowers. So instead of ordering an immediate attack, Kennedy chose a dangerous middle path. The United States would establish a naval quarantine around Cuba and stop additional Soviet offensive weapons from reaching the island. But there was a frightening problem. The missiles already in Cuba were still there. They were being prepared, the clock was ticking, and nobody knew whether Khrushchev would back down or fight to protect them. The American president had just discovered the threat, but the world had no idea how close it was to the edge. And over the next few days, every ship. On October 22, 1962, millions of people sat in front of their television screens as President John F. Kennedy delivered one of the most serious speeches in American history. He revealed that the United States had discovered Soviet nuclear missile sites in Cuba and announced that American forces would establish a naval quarantine around the island. For ordinary people, the words were frightening because this was no longer a distant Cold War confrontation. It was happening just 90 miles from American soil. Soviet ships were already moving toward Cuba, while American naval forces waited in the Atlantic. And for a moment, the entire world seemed to be holding its breath. What would happen if those ships refused to stop? Would American forces fire? Would the Soviet Union retaliate? And could one exchange of gunfire trigger a nuclear war? On October 24th, the tension reached another dangerous point as Soviet ships approached the quarantine line. But the immediate confrontation was avoided when several ships slowed down or changed course. It seemed like the crisis might finally be moving toward a peaceful solution, but the danger inside Cuba was still growing. Soviet missile sites continued to be developed, and American reconnaissance flights showed that the weapons could soon become operational. Then came October 27th, a day that would later be remembered as one of the most dangerous moments of the entire Cold War. An American U-2 aircraft was shot down over Cuba, killing its pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson Jr. Suddenly, pressure on Kennedy to launch military action became even stronger. But Kennedy understood something terrifying. If America attacked, the Soviet Union might strike back, and if the Soviets struck back, America could respond again. A chain reaction could begin that no leader might be able to stop. Behind closed doors, messages were racing between Washington and Moscow as both sides desperately searched for a way out. The world was waiting, frightened and uncertain, because the next decision made by two men, Kennedy and Khrushchev, could determine whether the crisis ended with a compromise or with the unimaginable sound of nuclear weapons being launched. By October 26th, the Cuban Missile Crisis had reached a terrifying turning point, and behind the scenes, both Washington and Moscow were desperately searching for a way to avoid war. Then a message arrived from Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev that offered a possible way out. The Soviet Union would consider removing its missiles from Cuba if the United States promised not to invade the island. For Kennedy, this was a chance for peace, but the situation was far from over. The very next day, another message arrived from Moscow, and this time the Soviets demanded something more: the removal of American Jupiter missiles from Turkey, which were positioned relatively close to Soviet territory. Kennedy now faced an incredibly difficult choice. If he rejected the demand, the crisis could continue and perhaps turn into war. If he accepted it too openly, it could appear that the United States had surrendered to Soviet pressure. So a carefully negotiated solution began to take shape. Publicly, the United States would agree not to invade Cuba, while the Soviet Union would remove its nuclear missiles from the island. But behind the scenes, American officials also agreed that the Jupiter missiles in Turkey would eventually be removed. It was a secret understanding designed to give both sides a way to step back without humiliating the other. Yet even then, nothing was guaranteed. Thousands of miles away, military forces remained on alert, missile sites were still being watched, and millions of ordinary people had no idea how close their world had come to disaster. For 13 tense days, the fate of humanity had seemed to hang on a handful of decisions made behind closed doors. Now there was only one question left. Would Khrushchev accept the deal and pull the Soviet missiles out of Cuba? Or would the confrontation continue until someone finally made a decision that could not be undone? On October 28, 1962, after 13 days of fear, uncertainty, and unimaginable pressure, the world finally received the news it had been waiting for. Nikita Khrushchev announced that the Soviet Union would remove its nuclear missiles from Cuba. For millions of people who had spent days wondering whether they would wake up to a nuclear war, the immediate danger was finally beginning to disappear. The Soviet missiles were dismantled and removed from the island, while the United States agreed not to invade Cuba and later removed its Jupiter missiles from Turkey as part of the secret understanding between the two sides. The American naval quarantine eventually ended, and the most dangerous confrontation of the Cold War came to a close. But although the world had stepped back from the edge, the crisis left a deep mark on both superpowers. Kennedy and Khrushchev had seen just how quickly a political confrontation could spiral toward nuclear destruction, especially when fear, incomplete information, military pressure, and misunderstanding were involved. In the aftermath, Washington and Moscow took steps to improve direct communication, including the creation of a hotline between the two governments. In 1963, the United States, Soviet Union, and Britain also signed the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, another important step toward reducing tensions. But perhaps the greatest lesson of the Cuban Missile Crisis was not about who won or who lost. It was about how close the world had come to a disaster that no one could truly control. For 13 days, humanity stood dangerously close to the possibility of nuclear war, and the difference between peace and catastrophe depended on the decisions of a few people sitting behind closed doors. The missiles were eventually removed, the ships turned away, and the crisis ended, but the memory remained. Because the Cuban Missile Crisis taught the world a frightening truth. When nations possess weapons capable of destroying millions of lives, sometimes the greatest victory is not defeating your enemy, but finding a way to step back before it is too late.